Commander, they're here. Major Harper's voice crackled through the comms, filled with urgency. Colonel Elias Voss stood at the front of the Earth Defense Coalition's war room, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. The deep hum of the ship's engines and the distant thrum of alarms were the only sounds in the tense silence that enveloped the command center. Outside the massive windows, a cold expanse of space stretched endlessly, the black void interrupted only by the gleaming menace of the Kurel fleet. Their warships loomed in the distance, vast and overwhelming, like dark mountains advancing toward a fragile, defenseless world. "Bring up the tactical display," Voss ordered, his voice tight, fighting to remain calm as his heart pounded in his chest. His eyes tracked the approaching fleet, each ship larger than anything humanity had ever faced. They had no way of matching the Kurel's technological superiority. Their fleet outnumbered Earth's defenses, their weapons more advanced than anything in human hands. The Kurel had obliterated entire civilizations in their wake. And now, Earth was their next target. The display flickered to life, showing the dwindling fleet of human defenses, meager and scattered. The Kurel's fleet had already torn through several outer defense lines, leaving the Earth Defense Coalition's forces strained and reeling. "How long until they're in range of the atmosphere?" Voss asked, forcing himself to focus, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of his responsibility. "Less than 10 minutes, sir," reported Lieutenant Harris, her face grim as she studied the screens in front of her. "Our defense systems are already under heavy fire. They're pushing through every line we've established." Voss clenched his jaw. They were losing, and quickly. The odds were impossible. But there was something they had that the Kurel couldn't account for. Something that, despite all their power, might still make the difference. "We're outgunned, outnumbered, they think we're weak," Voss muttered under his breath, his gaze fixed on the display. The Kurel had mocked Earth's final warning, dismissing humanity's threats as empty boasts. They had underestimated them. And now it was time to prove them wrong. He took a slow breath, turning to face his officers. "We fight on our terms. We'll give them something they'll never see coming." A few skeptical glances passed among the crew, but no one questioned him. In their eyes, Voss was their leader. Calm, composed, decisive. He had led them through smaller battles, but this was different. This was their last chance to stand before the Kurel wiped them from existence. "Activate the decoy operation," Voss ordered firmly, his voice cutting through the air. "Give them something to chase, a phantom target. Every ship we lose will be another test of their arrogance." Major Harper, always composed but now visibly tense, nodded sharply. "Understood, sir. Initiating now." The fleet had been hastily assembled, every ship modified with false signals and decoys to mimic human ships. It was their only hope, to draw the Kurel's fire away from Earth and into empty space, buying precious time. But even this would be a long shot. Humanity had no illusions of victory through brute force. Their strength lay in cunning, in their ability to adapt, to make the impossible seem inevitable. Voss turned back to the tactical display. The decoy ships would scatter across space, creating a web of confusion. The Kurel would waste their firepower on empty vessels, and humanity's survivors would have a moment, a fleeting opportunity, to regroup. "Sir," Lieutenant Harris said, her voice cracking through the tense atmosphere. "The Kurel are locking onto the decoys. They're opening fire." On the screen, multiple points of light erupted in a series of explosions as the Kurel unleashed their deadly barrage. Voss didn't flinch. Every shot that missed its true target brought them one step closer to survival. "They're taking the bait," Voss said quietly, watching the chaos unfold. It wasn't a victory yet, far from it, but it was a start. It bought them the breathing room they desperately needed. "We've bought ourselves a few minutes. Let's make sure we use them well," Voss added. His mind was already racing ahead to the next phase of their plan. The decoys wouldn't last long, and once they were gone, the Kurel would be back to finish the job. He turned to his chief strategist, Commander Margot, who had been studying the Kurel's movements on the display. "Margot, what's our best chance now?" Margot's face was tight with concentration as she scrolled through data on her console. "We need to disrupt their command structure. I recommend hacking their communication network, feeding them false orders. We can make them second-guess every move, break their coordination. It's risky, but it's our best shot. Voss nodded. It was a dangerous gamble. But the alternative was extinction. Make it happen, he ordered. We can't afford to let them recover from this. Margot immediately sent the order through. Hacking sequence initiated. It'll take a few minutes to penetrate their systems, but I'm confident we can create enough confusion to buy us more time. As Voss watched, the Corel continued their attack, but their movements seemed less coordinated now. The once dominant fleet faltering. False orders were being fed into their system, causing confusion among their ranks. It wasn't enough to stop the Corel, but it was enough to slow them down. Sir, Major Harper called out again, her voice strained. We're receiving an encrypted message from the Corel flagship. Voss's eyes narrowed. This could be the breakthrough they needed. Put it through. The screen flickered to life, displaying the face of a Corel commander. His expression was cold, devoid of emotion, an alien visage that Voss had seen in countless intelligence briefings. The commander's voice echoed through the room, smooth and mechanical. You have no hope, Earth. We will destroy you. Your resistance is meaningless. Voss stared at the screen, unblinking. There was no trace of fear in his eyes, only a quiet determination. Then I guess we'll have to make you regret that. Voss's words were laced with a calm menace. Prepare for the next phase, crew. We're going to teach them why they should never underestimate humanity. As the Corel commander's expression shifted to confusion, Voss turned his attention to the tactical display. The first phase was complete, but the real battle had only just begun. He didn't have much time. The next move would be everything. Prepare for evasive maneuvers, get the rest of our fleet in position, Voss commanded. The fight for Earth was only just beginning. The odds were still stacked against them, but Voss knew one thing for sure. The Corel had made a fatal mistake. They had mocked Earth's final warning, dismissed it as a threat from a weak, helpless species. But they would soon learn what humanity was truly capable of. Earth would not go down without a fight. With a final glance at the decoys scattering across space, Voss felt the weight of his next decision settle on his shoulders. Humanity had no choice but to win. The decoy ships scattered into space like ragged pieces of a broken puzzle, their signals pulsing weakly into the vast emptiness. Colonel Elias Voss stood rigid, his eyes glued to the tactical display as the Corel fleet loomed just beyond the edge of the atmosphere. The massive alien warships, powerful and ominous, surged forward, a relentless tide that would overwhelm anything in its path. Yet humanity's best chance lay in subverting that very tide. Decoys are away, sir, Major Harper reported, her fingers a blur as she typed into her console. We've rigged them to mimic the frequency of our main fleet. If they take the bait, we should have a few minutes. Voss nodded, but his mind raced. A few minutes. That was all they had. His eyes flickered to the empty space beyond, wondering just how much time the decoys would buy. Humanity had no more options. Either they outsmarted the Corel, or Earth would fall today. He glanced at the crew, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of screens, each of them fully aware that their survival depended on this moment. The silence in the war room felt deafening. Voss felt the weight of command pressing down on him. His decisions, his leadership, would determine whether humanity had a future, or whether it would be swallowed whole by the Corel. The Corel had underestimated Earth. They had mocked the final warning, the desperate plea to retreat. And now, humanity would show them why they should never make such a mistake again. Hold steady, Voss muttered under his breath, watching the decoy ships zip across the tactical grid. The Corel took the bait faster than expected. Moments later, the first volley of fire ripped through the empty space where the decoys once were. A series of bright flashes lit up the dark void, each one a blast that missed its target by miles. The Corel had wasted their firepower, and in the absence of their true target, confusion began to ripple through their lines. Direct hits on the decoys, sir, Lieutenant Harris said, her voice crackling through the comms. They're going for the false signals. It's working. Voss didn't allow himself to feel relief, yet. It was only the beginning. The Corel might be distracted, but the real danger still loomed. The decoys had done their job, but the clock was ticking. Humanity's window was rapidly closing, and the Corel weren't going to stay distracted forever. Now we go to Phase 2, Voss ordered, his voice sharp. The second phase would be riskier. The decoys had bought them time, but what they needed now was to cripple the Corel's ability to communicate, to sow chaos in their command structure. It was time for cyber warfare. He turned toward Margot, his chief strategist. Margot had been silent until now, her face a mask of concentration. She had already begun the intricate process of infiltrating the Corel's network. Voss trusted her more than anyone else in this room. If anyone could pull off this gamble, it was her. Margot, Voss said, his voice low but steady. What's our status on hacking their systems? Her fingers flew across her console. We're in position, but it's going to be tight. We're dealing with an encrypted system that's leagues ahead of our own. But I can do this. We'll flood their communication channels with conflicting orders. Confusion will spread through their fleet. I'll break their coordination. Voss nodded. Do it. The weight of the mission was clear in Margot's eyes. She didn't hesitate as she initiated the hack. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the understanding that the success of this maneuver could either turn the tide or lead them into disaster. On the tactical display, the Corel fleet continued its barrage against the decoys, but their movements began to change. They hesitated. Ships slowed their advances, pivoting this way and that, as if their commanders were receiving conflicting instructions. Voss watched the screen with a hard stare, silently willing the plan to work. Commander, Major Harper said, her voice rising with urgency, they've stopped attacking. They're regrouping. Good, Voss muttered. It wasn't over yet, but it was a sign that humanity was having an effect. The Corel's overconfidence had been their greatest flaw, and now they were paying the price. They had underestimated humanity's resourcefulness. Voss only hoped they would continue to do so. The seconds dragged on as Margot worked tirelessly, her hands dancing over the keyboard. Her focus was unwavering, even as the stakes grew higher with each passing moment. The Corel were not just attacking, they were beginning to second-guess themselves. There was no more unity in their movements. Ships were scattering, their lines broken, their formations collapsing into disarray. Phase 2 complete, sir, Margot said, her voice carrying both relief and determination. Their command structure is in complete chaos. We've broken their communication lines. They won't be able to coordinate effectively for the next few minutes. Voss exhaled slowly, though the tension in his chest remained. It wasn't a victory. It was just the first step in a much larger battle. But for the first time since the Corel's arrival, humanity had something they could cling to. Time. We keep them on the back foot, Voss said. No mercy. We exploit every second. Prepare for Phase 3. Counterattack. The crew responded immediately, each person moving with purpose. Their confidence had shifted from mere survival to the possibility of a victory, a real chance at turning the tide. But they knew the risks were far from over. The Corel would adapt. They always did. Voss's eyes were fixed on the screen, watching as the Corel regrouped. They had lost their sense of coordination, but their strength in numbers and firepower remained. They would recover. Humanity's fight had only just begun, and now it was time to take the battle to the heart of the Corel fleet. Prepare for the next phase, Voss repeated, his voice carrying the weight of command. They've learned that Earth will not go down quietly. Let's make sure they learn it again. The decoys had done their job, but it was humanity's ingenuity that had brought them this far. Now it was time to press the advantage, to keep the Corel off balance. Voss could feel the eyes of his crew on him, waiting for the next order. He met their gaze without hesitation. We fight not just to survive, Voss said, his voice calm but resolute. We fight to make them regret ever underestimating us. With the first strike having been successful, and the Corel now in disarray, humanity had a fleeting opportunity to strike back. Voss wasn't about to let it slip away. They had to act before the Corel recovered. The battle was just beginning, but this time, it was on humanity's terms. The quiet hum of the command center was broken only by the soft beeping of the status monitors, each sound echoing with a sense of finality. The decoy ships had done their job, and the Kurel were still reeling from the confusion, but even as humanity gained a fleeting advantage, the toll of war was becoming evident. Reeve stood at the center of the room, his face drawn, eyes bloodshot from sleepless hours spent coordinating the defense. The victory, hard won though it was, had already begun to feel hollow. "Report," he said, his voice low, but the weight of command unmistakable. Lieutenant Harris was at her console, fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard as she delivered the grim news. "Sir, we've lost 3 more ships. The Cassandra, the Eagle, and the Peregrine didn't make it out of the last engagement. We're down to less than half of our initial fleet." The room fell silent. Major Harper looked up, her expression as grim as Reeves'. The crew members around them exchanged somber glances, knowing that each loss wasn't just a ship. It was a person, a family member, someone who would never come home. Reeve turned away from Harris's report, unable to meet her gaze. The faces of the fallen lingered in his mind, each one a reminder of the heavy cost they had already paid for a war they never sought. But there was no time to mourn, not yet. He glanced at Margot, his chief strategist, who was studying the tactical display. Her hands were steady, but Reeve could see the weight she was carrying in the set of her jaw. She had been the architect of their last few operations, but even her brilliance couldn't shield them from the inevitable losses of war. "How much longer until the Kurel adapt?" Reeve asked, his voice strained with the pressure of the decision he had to make next. "We've bought some time," Margot answered, looking up from her console, "but they're learning. They're starting to consolidate their forces again. I'd give it a few more hours before they adjust their tactics completely." Reeve nodded. A few hours. That was all they had before the Kurel regained their focus and adapted. The window for decisive action was rapidly closing. The losses were mounting, and every additional minute brought them closer to the edge of annihilation. "Phase 3, Reeve said quietly, a sense of finality in his words. "We infiltrate. We break their command structure from the inside." The room was still. Even the usual hum of the consoles seemed to quiet as the magnitude of the order set in. The infiltration mission was a gamble, one that would cost them even more. Reeve knew that sending a small elite team into the heart of the Kurel fleet was a move of desperation. It wasn't a guaranteed victory, it was a risk. But humanity had no other choice. They had to strike before the Kurel regrouped. "We'll need volunteers," Reeve said, his eyes scanning the room. "I need a team of 5. This is a one-way mission." The room fell into a heavy silence as the crew members processed the weight of his words. Major Harper met his gaze, the pain of each loss reflected in her eyes. She knew what was coming. This mission would take the best of them, and it might take them all. "We're with you, sir," Harper said quietly. "Just tell us what to do." Reeve gave a sharp nod, grateful for her unwavering support, though a part of him hated the weight of what he was asking. He knew that each soldier who volunteered was signing up for a death sentence, but their mission was humanity's last hope, and that truth held no room for compromise. "We'll take a stealth approach," Margot chimed in, breaking the silence. "We infiltrate through the Vornax flagship. Once we're inside, we plant the disruptors in their core systems. It'll destabilize their command center long enough for us to get out." Reeve turned toward her, his face hard. "And the odds of getting out?" Margot hesitated, her eyes flickering briefly with uncertainty. "Slim, but it's the best shot we've got." Reeve's chest tightened. Every instinct told him this mission would lead to more deaths, but as the weight of the situation settled over him, he realized there was no other option. They couldn't wait for the Kurel to regroup. They couldn't allow the enemy to recover their strength. "All right," he said, the words heavy on his tongue. "We move now. Prepare for deployment. Make it quick. We don't have much time." The crew sprang into action, each person knowing the gravity of what was about to unfold. Reeve turned back to the tactical display, his mind churning as he mentally reviewed every angle of the plan. It was a perfect storm, desperate, risky, and uncertain. but it was their only hope. Hours passed in a blur of preparation and quiet determination. The crew worked in tense silence, knowing that their fate was sealed the moment they launched the mission. The last remaining ships were repositioned for defensive support, though they knew that if the mission failed, it would be the end for all of them. As the infiltration team prepared to board their stealth craft, Reeve found himself standing alone in front of the war room's large viewport. Outside, the endless darkness of space stretched out, indifferent to the struggle unfolding below. He took a long breath, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. What was it all for? The lives of his crew, the sacrifices made, and the countless fallen soldiers. It all seemed so futile when facing a force as unstoppable as the Kirin. Yet despite it all, he could feel the fire of defiance burning in his chest. Humanity had come this far, and they would not bow down without a fight. "Commander, the team is ready for launch," Major Harper said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. Reeve nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I know." He turned to face her, and for a moment they locked eyes. She had been with him since the beginning. Her loyalty, her courage. They were the reason he still stood here today, making these impossible decisions. The rest of the crew had placed their trust in him, and now they would place their lives in his hands once more. "Godspeed, Major," he said softly. Harper gave a sharp nod, her face hardening with resolve. "We'll make it count, sir." The team boarded their ships, the weight of the mission settling into their bones. Each member knew the risks. They knew they might never return. But in the end, it was the sacrifice they were willing to make for the survival of humanity. As the stealth crafts powered up, Reeve stood alone, watching as his people left for what might be their last mission. The room around him seemed quieter now, a hushed solemnity filling the air. In the midst of the chaos, of the impending battle, one thing became painfully clear to Reeve. The cost of survival was more than anyone should have to bear. Yet, humanity had no choice but to pay it. And so they would, whatever it took. The small team of elite soldiers, led by Major Harper, filed silently into the airlock, their breathing steady but their hearts pounding in the thick silence of their stealth craft. Their mission was a suicide run. There was no denying that. But it was their only shot. The Vornex was the heart of the Corel's command structure, the flagship where their entire war effort was coordinated. If they could cripple it, they could stop the Corel from ever being able to launch a full-scale retaliation. It was a move of desperation, but in desperate times, desperate actions were all that remained. "Team, you know the stakes," Major Harper said, her voice low but commanding. "In and out, no mistakes. Once we're inside, we don't stop until we hit their command center. Understood?" There was no hesitation in the team's responses. They were ready, not because they believed they would survive, but because they had a job to do. The Curiel had come to Earth with an air of arrogance, assuming humanity would cower and fall without a fight. Now it was time to show them what humanity was capable of when cornered. The airlock sealed behind them with a sharp hiss, and the ship's engines powered down. The Vornax loomed before them, an immense, jagged structure that seemed to pulse with cold, calculated power. The alien ship was a fortress, its hull covered in dark metallic plating that reflected the distant stars like a black mirror. The sheer size of it was enough to make any normal soldier falter. But there was no time for fear now. They had their orders. "Commence silent entry," Major Harper ordered as the team deployed. They would board the Vornax using the ship's maintenance docking port, an old, unused entryway that had been chosen specifically to avoid detection. Their small stealth craft had bypassed the Kyrell's outer defenses, slipping through the sensor grids unnoticed. The team moved in tight formation, weapons raised, their movements synchronized with quiet precision. Each step was deliberate, calculated. They made their way deeper into the heart of the Kyrell flagship, their suits' thermal dampeners masking their presence from the ship's security sensors. But despite the advanced tech at their disposal, there was no escaping the underlying tension. They could be detected at any moment. 5 minutes to target, Harper muttered, her voice steady despite the weight of the situation. The command center was deep within the heart of the ship, past several layers of security. Reeve had ordered the mission, and he trusted Harper with this final, critical task. It was now or never. The team moved through the narrow corridors, their footsteps barely making a sound on the cold metal floors. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant echo of movement caused their muscles to tense, but the team pushed on. They were close. "Stop," whispered Sergeant Turner, the lead infiltrator. She paused, her hand raised, signaling the others to follow her lead. Ahead of them, a Corel patrol rounded the corner. Harper's pulse quickened as she crouched low, her team blending into the shadows. The patrol passed without noticing them, by mere inches. The mission's success depended on their ability to remain undetected, and for now they had managed to slip by. "Clear," Turner said, leading them forward. They moved again, faster now, knowing they were on the edge of success. As they neared the command center, the tension was unbearable. The final stretch was the most dangerous, the heart of the Vornax, where the Kyrell's leadership operated. If they were caught now, it would be over. But there was no turning back. "Plant the explosives," Harper ordered, her voice a harsh whisper. "We've got one shot at this." The team moved into position, placing the disruptors, small, powerful devices, at critical points within the command center. These were no ordinary explosives. They were designed to fry the ship's central processing unit, scrambling its command structure and rendering the Corel's leadership helpless. As Turner crouched beside the main console, the countdown began. 5 minutes, Turner said, her voice steady, though the sweat on her brow betrayed the tension. The Kyrell would notice the disruption soon, but by then the damage would be done. Harper's eyes flickered to the countdown. "We're almost done, everyone stay sharp." They had no idea how much time they had left before the Kyrell reacted. But there was no turning back now. The Vornax was vulnerable. If they succeeded in this mission, the Kyrell's entire battle strategy would collapse. Suddenly the silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. The patrols had found them. Turner cursed under her breath, eyes wide with urgency. "Hide," Harper hissed, "now." They scattered into the darkness of the command center's shadowed corners, weapons raised, every fiber of their beings tensed for the inevitable conflict. Their only hope was to remain undetected until the explosives detonated. The Kyrell patrol entered, their mechanical footsteps reverberating off the walls. The aliens moved in and out of the shadows, their cold, calculating eyes scanning the room. They were only a few feet away from the team. Harper held her breath, her hands shaking as she tightened her grip on her rifle. Just as one of the Kyrell officers passed by Turner's hiding spot, the countdown beeped, signaling the imminent detonation. "Get down," Harper shouted. The Kyrell officers reacted too late. The explosives detonated with a deafening roar, and the room was filled with a blinding flash of light. The Kyrell shrieked in alarm as their command center plunged into chaos. Sparks flew from consoles, and the lights flickered violently as the Vornax trembled from the impact. Harper and her team scrambled to their feet, firing their weapons at the disoriented Kyrell officers. The aliens were reeling, confused by the sudden assault. The human soldiers moved with deadly efficiency, taking out the remaining Kyrell personnel before they could send a distress signal. "We've done it," Turner said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. Harper quickly glanced at the console. Status reports flashed, confirming that the Kyrell's command network had been utterly crippled. The leadership was cut off, isolated. The Kyrell had lost control of their fleet, but their success came at a cost. The explosion had drawn the attention of the entire ship, and sirens began blaring throughout the Vornax. Harper's heart pounded as she barked orders to her team. "Fall back. Move. Now." The team sprinted for the exit, navigating the wreckage and debris of the shattered command center. They had no time to savor the victory. As the Vornax began to destabilize, the Kyrell would come in force. They had to get out before the ship collapsed around them. The final moments were a blur of running, dodging, and gunfire. They fought their way through the corridors, but the enemy was closing in. Harper's mind raced as she led her team back toward the extraction point, praying the small stealth craft would be their ticket to survival. With the Vornax now spiraling into disarray and their mission complete, the last stand had been won. But they had only seconds before the Kyrell responded. Harper pushed forward, determination and adrenaline driving her to the very edge. The Vornax was gone. The flagship that had carried the might of the Kirel Empire, its heart ripped apart in a flash of fire and chaos, was no more. The ship's destruction sent shockwaves through the Kirel fleet, plunging their command into disarray. What had once been an unstoppable force was now a scattered, vulnerable mass of ships lost without direction. The Kirel leadership, once so confident in their dominance, were suddenly grasping at straws, their empire crumbling beneath their feet. Colonel Elias Reeve stood at the command center of the Earth Defense Coalition, watching the tactical display as the Kirel fleet fractured in real time. The once proud warships, their hulls scarred by battle, drifted aimlessly, some abandoning the field while others faltered, unable to respond to their broken command structure. Victory was within reach. Humanity had weathered the storm, but as Reeve stood there taking in the sight of the Kirel's disintegration, a hollow feeling settled in his chest. This was a moment of triumph, yes, but also one of immense sacrifice. "Sir, the Kirel fleet is retreating," Lieutenant Harris reported, her voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. "Their command is in disarray. We've broken their hold over the sector." Reeve's eyes remained fixed on the screen, his mind replaying the faces of the fallen, the soldiers they had lost, the ships that had been destroyed. It all weighed on him. They had won, but the cost had been steep. Lives had been sacrificed, and the damage done to their own fleet was not easily forgotten. "I know," he said quietly, his voice lacking the triumphant note that might have been expected. "But it's not over yet." His gaze turned inward for a moment as he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The Kirel had underestimated humanity, dismissing their final warning as a feeble threat. They had underestimated their will to fight, their ingenuity, and their resolve. The final blow, the infiltration of the Vornax, had been the turning point. But what followed was not just a tactical victory. It was the culmination of all the sacrifices, the blood spilled, and the lives lost in defense of Earth's very existence. "Sir," Major Harper said, her voice bringing him back to the present. She was standing nearby, her expression worn but resolute. "The Kirel leadership is requesting a meeting. They're asking for terms of surrender." Reeve didn't immediately respond. He knew the Kirel were broken, but hearing them plead for mercy felt like a bitter victory. They had mocked humanity's final warning, had brushed them off as insignificant. Now they were at humanity's mercy. Reeve had no doubt they would beg for their survival, but it wasn't his job to be merciful. It was his job to ensure humanity's future, and he would do whatever it took to ensure that the Kirel would never again threaten his people. "Arrange the meeting," he said after a pause, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. "Let's end this." A few moments later, the Kirel representative appeared on the screen. The alien leader, their face cold and expressionless, stared back at Reeve with an air of arrogance that hadn't yet faded, despite their overwhelming defeat. The Kirel had always believed themselves to be the pinnacle of galactic power, and now they were brought low, their empire shattered by a species they had once dismissed as insignificant. "We request terms of surrender," the Kirel representative said, their voice flat and mechanical, lacking the fire it had held before. "We acknowledge that we underestimated humanity. We seek to negotiate a ceasefire." Reeve's gaze was unwavering. The Kirel had underestimated them, and now they were paying the price. There was no sympathy in his heart for these invaders, no room for forgiveness after all the lives lost. But he had to finish this. The galaxy needed to know that humanity would not be crushed under the weight of alien conquest. Earth had fought back, and now it would rise as a new power. "The terms are simple," Reeve replied, his voice sharp. "You leave Earth space. You surrender your claim over our sector, and you will never threaten us again. If you do, humanity will respond, and we will finish what we started." The Kirel representative hesitated, their expression flickering for a moment before they regained their composure. The arrogance that had once been so evident was now gone, replaced by a reluctant acceptance of their fate. They were no longer in control, and they knew it. "Our fleet is in shambles," the the Kyrell leader admitted, their voice resigned. We are broken. Earth has won. The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment Reeve felt a rush of pride. They had done it. Against all odds, humanity had fought back and emerged victorious. But that pride was quickly tempered by the reality of the cost. So many lives had been lost, so much had been sacrificed. The victory was hollow, a bittersweet achievement. The dead could not be brought back. The scars would remain. Then leave, Reeve said, his voice firm. And if you ever dare to threaten Earth again, you won't be so lucky. The Kyrell leader bowed their head, the acceptance in their posture a silent acknowledgement of their defeat. They were broken, and humanity had proven its strength. The transmission ended, leaving the war room in a heavy silence. Reeve turned to his crew, his mind still processing the enormity of what had just transpired. They had won, yes, but at what cost? The toll of the war, the loss of ships, the lives of soldiers who would never see their families again. It was a heavy burden to carry. He stepped away from the command center and walked to the viewport, staring out into the vastness of space. The black void seemed indifferent to the struggles that had just unfolded, but Earth had earned its place. They had survived, and now they would thrive. Is it over? Major Harper's voice broke through the silence, and Reeve turned to face her. Her expression was somber, her eyes reflecting the same weariness he felt. For now, Reeve replied quietly, but we have to rebuild. The galaxy will know we're not to be underestimated, but we'll do it the right way. We'll make sure this never happens again. As he gazed out at the stars, Reeve felt a strange sense of both finality and hope. Humanity had been pushed to the brink, but it had survived. And in the aftermath of this war, they had not only earned their freedom, they had earned respect. The Kyrell would never forget what had happened here, and neither would the galaxy. The Kyrell fleet had been scattered, their command structure obliterated, and yet, as Colonel Elias Reeve stood at the viewport of the Earth Defense Coalition's command center, he couldn't shake the weight of what had transpired. Earth had won. Victory had been earned with blood, sweat, and unimaginable sacrifice, but the cost was immeasurable. The distant stars beyond the glass seemed to mock him, distant and indifferent, as he watched his people begin the long and painful process of rebuilding. Sir, Major Harper's voice broke through his thoughts, bringing him back to the present. The council is ready for your report. Reeve nodded, but didn't move immediately. He could still hear the echoes of the battles, the cries of his fallen comrades, the faces of the men and women who had given their lives for a cause that, now that it was won, seemed so distant. The victory had been hard fought, but it had come at an extraordinary price. The survivors would live with that knowledge forever. Tell them I'll be there in a moment, Reeve said quietly, his voice hoarse, as if he'd aged years in the span of a few days. The victory had given Earth the recognition it had long deserved. The Kyrell Empire, once considered the most powerful force in the galaxy, was in ruins, and Earth, a planet once written off as insignificant, had emerged as a force to be reckoned with. But the future that lay ahead was uncertain, and Reeve knew that the hard part was just beginning. The weight of leadership had never felt so heavy. The galaxy would not simply hand them a place at the table. They would have to earn it. As Reeve made his way toward the briefing room, he couldn't help but think of the fallen. The soldiers, the officers, the families who would never get their loved ones back. The faces of those who had stood beside him, their bravery unmatched. He could still hear their voices in his head. Sergeant Turner, who had led the infiltration mission into the Vornax, her final words echoing in his mind. Lieutenant Evans, who had never hesitated to fight, even when the odds were insurmountable. Major Harper, always at his side, always ready to give everything for the cause. The faces of the dead were a weight he couldn't escape. He entered the briefing room to find the Earth's new leadership assembled, a mixture of military and civilian leaders. They were all there, looking to him for answers, looking to him for the future. The room fell silent as Reeve entered, all eyes on him. He could see the hope in their gazes, but also the weight of their responsibility. The war was over, but its echoes would be felt for generations. "We did it," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "Earth has survived. The Kirel are defeated. But the cost was immense." There was a brief silence, the gravity of the moment settling over the room. The leaders around the table were waiting for the next words, but Reeve had nothing more to offer them right now than the truth. Their victory had been secured, but at a cost too high to ever truly forget. "We've lost good people," Reeve continued, his voice steady despite the emotional weight. "Thousands of lives. Our fleet has been decimated. But we've secured our future. Now, we need to ensure that what we've fought for doesn't slip through our fingers." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The war had shattered everything: systems, fleets, families. But humanity had risen to meet the challenge. Now, they would have to rebuild, not just their home, but their standing in the galaxy. Reeve's mind drifted to the long road ahead. Earth had to not only rebuild its cities and defenses, but also its reputation. The galaxy would now look to Earth as a beacon of resilience and strength. The Kirel's defeat would send ripples throughout the cosmos, and every faction would be watching to see how humanity would handle its newfound power. There would be those who would seek to undermine them, those who would view Earth's rise with envy. Reeve knew the road to peace would be fraught with new challenges, but humanity had shown it could endure. As the meeting progressed, discussions of reconstruction and diplomacy filled the air. Earth's new leadership was in the process of forming alliances with the few other surviving races in the galaxy. But the real task ahead was securing humanity's place as a new power. And, just as importantly, making sure history remembered their victory, not for the destruction it caused, but for the resilience of the human spirit. Later, as the meeting ended and the room began to empty, Reeve remained behind. He stood before the large display window, staring out at the dark void of space. He could see the remnants of the Kirel fleet, broken and retreating, scattered like debris across the vastness of the galaxy. Humanity had taken its place among the stars, but Reeve couldn't help but feel the absence of those who had given their lives to get them there. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was a picture of the crew who had served with him, many of whom had not made it out alive. Their smiles were frozen in time, a memory of a world before the war. A world that, for them, was lost forever. He stared at the photograph for a long time, his thoughts drifting. The war was over, but the scars it had left would never fade. He would carry them with him forever. And yet, despite the loss, there was something else. Something hopeful. Humanity had faced its darkest hour and emerged stronger for it. There was no going back to the way things were before, but the future was still unwritten, and Earth had earned its place in the galaxy. Major Harper entered quietly, her footsteps soft on the floor. She stood beside him, her gaze following his. There was no need for words between them. They had both seen too much, lost too much, to speak easily about what came next. "Do you ever think we'll be able to look at the stars the same way again?" Harper asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Reeve looked out into the endless dark, the distant twinkling stars now symbols of both the hope and the cost of their survival. "No," he replied, his voice steady but filled with a deep sadness. "But maybe that's the way it has to be." Harper nodded, understanding without words. The stars would always carry the weight of what they had lost, but they also carried the weight of what they had gained. "Humanity's future is ours to shape," Reeve said finally, turning away from the window. "We've earned it, but we must never forget the cost." Harper stood in silence, a slight nod of acknowledgement the only response she gave. They both understood. The future was theirs, but it would never be without its burdens. As Reeve and Harper walked out of the command center, the weight of the past heavy on their shoulders, they knew the journey ahead would be long. But the future was bright, and humanity would rebuild, not just on Earth, but throughout the stars. The war was over, but the real battle had only just begun. Earth's victory had shattered the Kiriel Empire, but as Reeve stood in the new command center, Watching the latest diplomatic reports stream in, he realized the weight of the journey ahead. Humanity had earned its place in the galaxy, but maintaining it would require far more than military might. The galaxy was vast, filled with factions and powers that viewed Earth's rise with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Earth was no longer a forgotten planet, but they were a new force in a galaxy full of complex dynamics. The path to securing Earth's future would be fraught with political maneuvering, delicate negotiations, and the constant balancing act between asserting strength and building alliances. Reeve walked through the halls of the Earth Defense Coalition's headquarters, his steps deliberate as he thought about the years ahead. It had been months since the Corel had been defeated, but Earth was still recovering. The scars of the war, both physical and emotional, were still fresh. The soldiers who had fought in the battle still bore the weight of their sacrifices. But now there was hope. The war had shown the galaxy that humanity was more than just a survivor. It had proven that Earth could rise to meet the challenges of a dangerous universe. "Commander," Major Harper's voice broke his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, holding a data pad. "The first diplomatic envoy is ready for launch. The Corel are no longer a threat, but the real test begins now. We're heading to the Galactic Council." Reeve nodded, his mind already shifting into the role that humanity now found itself in. A newly recognized player on the galactic stage. The Corel's defeat had won them respect, but now they had to prove that humanity could maintain that respect. That they weren't a fleeting power, but a lasting one. "We're not just attending as observers anymore," Reeve said, his voice steady. "We're going to assert ourselves. It's time we show the galaxy what humanity can do." The diplomatic envoy was a critical step in solidifying Earth's place in galactic politics. Reeve and his crew had been chosen to represent Earth, not just because of their military experience, but because they were symbols of humanity's potential. They had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. Now, they would take that same determination into the halls of diplomacy. The journey to the Galactic Council was a long one, and as Reeve sat in the sleek, silent spacecraft, he felt the weight of the mission settling over him. They were about to meet with representatives from dozens of different worlds, each with their own interests, histories, and alliances. Some would see Earth's rise as a challenge, others as an opportunity. But all would be watching, waiting to see if humanity's unity would survive the tests ahead. "Do you ever think we'll be ready for this?" Harper asked, her voice soft. She sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the stars outside. The calmness of the journey contrasted sharply with the turbulence of the unknown that lay ahead. "We'll never be ready," Reeve replied, his tone reflective. "But we're here, and that's what matters." The diplomatic meeting began as soon as they arrived at the Galactic Council station, a sprawling structure in the heart of a neutral sector. The room where they gathered was unlike anything Reeve had ever seen. It was a massive circular hall with holographic displays and long translucent tables that stretched out in front of each representative. The air was thick with the presence of alien life, some humanoid, others completely foreign in form. But despite the differences, one thing was clear. Humanity had earned a place among them. The council members regarded Earth with a mix of wariness and respect. They had watched as humanity stood against the Corel and emerged victorious. Some were skeptical about Earth's ability to handle the responsibilities of galactic diplomacy, while others saw the potential for powerful alliances. Reeve and his crew, standing at the forefront of the Earth delegation, represented not just military triumph, but the resilience of a species that had faced extinction and come through the other side stronger. "I'm sure you all have questions about our intentions," Reeve began, his voice calm but commanding. "The war is over, but the real challenge is how we move forward. Humanity is not interested in conflict. We seek peace, but we seek it on our terms, on the terms of freedom and respect." The room grew quiet as Reeve spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't just speaking for Earth. He was speaking for every human who had fought and died for this moment. The faces of the fallen flashed in his mind, and for a brief second, he felt the loss of those who would never be here to see this moment. But he knew they were with him in spirit, and that thought fueled his words. "We understand that the galaxy is complex," Reeve continued, "that there are many factions with competing interests. But Earth will not be cowed. We will forge alliances, not through subjugation, but through cooperation. We are willing to share our knowledge, our resources, and our strength with those who respect our sovereignty. The representatives of various worlds exchanged murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others narrowing their eyes in skepticism. But Reeve had expected this. He had known the first step would be the hardest. The Council would need time to assess Earth's intentions, to determine whether humanity was truly ready to join the galactic community, or if they were simply another power-hungry empire waiting to assert dominance. But Reeve believed in what he had said. Humanity had shown its strength, and now it was time to prove that it could also show wisdom and restraint. The meeting continued with debates, agreements, and disagreements. Reeve and his team held their ground, knowing that this was just the beginning of a long road. The foundation of their future would be laid here, in this room. But it would take time, it would take effort, and it would take humility, something that humanity had not always been known for. As the meeting drew to a close, Reeve stepped away from the table, his mind already turning toward the next steps. The future of Earth was no longer in question. They had survived the war, but now they would have to prove that they could thrive. Humanity had won its place in the galaxy, but the true test was yet to come. Would they be able to navigate the complexities of galactic diplomacy and make allies? Or would they fall prey to the same mistakes that had led to the war in the first place? "Do you think they believe us?" Harper asked as she joined him, her voice laced with quiet uncertainty. Reeve turned toward her, a faint smile crossing his face. "I think they're watching. But I also think they're beginning to understand what we've known all along." "And what's that?" Harper asked. "That we're not going anywhere." The words hung in the air, a quiet affirmation of what humanity had fought for and what they still had to prove. Earth had earned its place in the galaxy, but the real journey was only beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, Reeve felt a glimmer of hope. The future was theirs to shape. As the delegates of the Galactic Council filed out of the room, Reeve and his crew remained, watching the stars outside the windows. They had crossed an ocean of bloodshed to reach this point, and while the scars would remain, the future of Earth, of humanity, was no longer in doubt. The next chapter had begun, and humanity would write it on its own terms. The stars outside the observation window glittered like distant diamonds, as if the universe itself were acknowledging humanity's triumph. Reeve stood at the center of the Earth Defense Coalition's headquarters, his eyes fixed on the breathtaking view of Earth below. The scars of war still marked the planet, cities rebuilt, memorials for the fallen. A new world rising from the ashes of the old. The Corel Empire was no more, and Earth was no longer an insignificant speck, and humanity had earned its place. But even now, with the galaxy watching, Reeve knew that their journey had only just begun. "Commander, it's time." Major Harper's voice broke the silence, her words steady and calm but carrying the weight of what they were about to face. Reeve turned from the window and faced her, nodding. His mind was a whirlwind of memories, the faces of the fallen, the battles fought, and the countless sacrifices made. Yet, through it all, he knew one thing for certain: humanity had endured. And now, they would lead. "Let's go," Reeve replied, his voice a mixture of resolve and reflection. He had seen the horrors of war firsthand, but what lay ahead was something far different. A new responsibility. A new role. A role that would test every ounce of their strength, their unity, their ability to balance the hard-earned power with the fragile peace they'd fought for. The corridors of the new Galactic Council building felt different than the halls of war. There was no sound of explosions, no distant cries of battle. Only the hum of hushed conversations, the diplomatic discussions between representatives of various species who once viewed Earth as nothing more than a pawn. But now, humanity was a respected player. Their rise had not been an accident. It had been earned with blood, sweat, and the iron will to survive. Inside the council chamber, Reeve and his team stood before representatives of the galaxy, each faction that once doubted them now acknowledging their strength. The seats of the galaxy's most powerful races were occupied by dignitaries who had once regarded Earth with disdain. Now, they looked at the humans not as mere survivors, but as equals. Humanity had done the impossible. Colonel Reeve, Major Harper, your leadership has been exemplary, a representative of the Celestian Federation said, his voice rich with respect. The galaxy watches your next steps with keen interest. Reeve nodded, acknowledging their words, but inside he could feel the weight of the moment. He had once been a soldier, fighting for survival. Now, he was a symbol of humanity's defiance, of its ability to rise from the ashes. But it wasn't enough to simply be seen. They had to prove that their strength would not falter, that their unity would endure. We are honored by the recognition, Reeve said, his voice steady. But this victory, as much as it has secured our place in the galaxy, is not the end. We did not rise to power to dominate. We rose to ensure that the galaxy would never again suffer under the oppression of an empire like the Kyril. He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was quiet, the eyes of dozens of alien races fixed on him. It was a long moment, and for a heartbeat, Reeve wondered if humanity had truly earned their place. But when he met Harper's gaze, he found the answer there. He knew they had. The next few hours were filled with diplomatic discussions, with treaties being signed and alliances forged. Earth's role in the galaxy was no longer a question, it was a fact. But as the last of the meetings concluded, Reeve found himself walking alone to the balcony overlooking the city below. The Earth he saw was no longer the one he had fought for all those years ago. It was a symbol of hope, a new dawn for humanity, and yet the victory felt bittersweet. You know, Major Harper said, appearing beside him, this new world, this new era, isn't going to be easy. The galaxy has its own set of rules, politics, power struggles, all of it. We may have beaten the Kyril, but we have to make sure the peace we've fought for survives. Reeve looked at her, his mind still swirling with thoughts of the future. I know, he said, his voice softer now. But we're not the Kyril. We've earned this place, but we won't take it by force. We'll earn the respect of the galaxy through our actions, through what we build, not what we destroy. Harper nodded, the fire of determination still in her eyes. We've made it this far, and we'll make sure it lasts. The weight of the past seemed to lift slightly as they stood there, the cool wind brushing against their faces. Earth had risen from nothing, from the verge of annihilation, to stand proudly among the stars. Humanity had done the impossible, and now the future was theirs to shape. As Reeve looked out at the city, he saw it in a new light. The streets, the people, the infrastructure, it all symbolized what they had fought for. The scars of war would remain, but they would heal, slowly but surely. The sacrifices made would never be forgotten, but they had built something that would endure. To think, Reeve said quietly, almost to himself, there was a time when we thought we were insignificant. A tiny planet in the vastness of space, but we showed them. We showed them what humanity can do when pushed to the edge. And now, we have to show them that we are not just a species of survival, but one of purpose. Harper stood beside him, silent for a moment before offering a small smile. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, sir. Reeve's gaze hardened with determination. I know. The war is over, but the fight for peace, for our place in the galaxy, that fight never ends. The two of them stood there in quiet reflection, looking out at the vastness of the universe. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs. Humanity had risen to the challenge, and now it had to prove that it was worthy of the responsibility it had been given. The Earth flag, proudly waving from the flagpoles below, fluttered in the wind. It wasn't just a symbol of victory. It was a symbol of what humanity had endured, and what it would continue to endure. The war had ended, but their journey was far from over. To a new era, Reeve said quietly, his voice firm with resolve. To Earth, Harper replied, her voice steady and sure. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city, Reeve took one last look at the planet he had fought for, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, humanity would face them with the same courage, strength, and unity that had brought them here. The fight for survival was over. Now, it was time for humanity to shape its own destiny.